Welcome to the Talent Revolution, Tales from the Trenches. I'm Jill Kniglio-Kirk.
And I'm Joe Shambum.
Hey, Joe, there's something I wanted to bounce off of you, and I don't know if it's just me, but have you ever had a conversation you just are totally avoiding or putting off having?
Pretty much every night, Jill. I never want to decide what we're having for dinner. Oh, wait a minute. You're talking about for work. All right. Um,
Yeah,
yes.
focus, Joe.
Well, it's almost dinner time, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's multiple with some executives, managers, and of course my employees that, it's whether it's pushing for candidates and timelines, but also employee situations that, yeah, it's never a fun conversation, and I hate avoiding it, but you have to do it.
No, and I think you're right. I mean, we face this in our personal lives, but we equally face it in our professional lives. And I thought it would be a worthwhile conversation today to talk about how do we tackle, the elephant in the room, so to speak, and maybe how do we get comfortable with a framework and a strategy of how we might be able to break this down into smaller bite-sized pieces so that people have more comfort navigating that dreaded conversation or that dreaded situation. Are you game?
Let's do it. I mean, I guess, so then how do we do that? I think everyone wants to have an easier, comfort, right? And I think that's, if you do these multiple times, which, you get better at it. So how do you get comfortable at doing this, Joe?
I don't know that comfortable is the right word. Truthfully, I think you can be prepared. It's always going to be uncomfortable because it's confrontation. Generally, it's some sort of confrontation. It's raising a topic that you either haven't talked about before, is a little bit personal or uncomfortable, either for you or the other individual. So I don't know that comfortable is the right word, but I think you will gain confidence for being prepared and having some steps that you can follow.
So just
I would
so
just
we're
start.
all
Go
on
ahead.
the same page, you were talking about a performance issue, a work issue, a separate thing that went on at work that you just have to have that difficult conversation, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could be an employee that works for you where you want to address a behavioral issue. It could be a performance issue or lack of follow through. It could be a conversation with your boss saying, I need more of your time. I need more of your support, right? It could be with a colleague of a similar thing saying, I need more clarity on how we're going to work together. What pieces do you own? What pieces do I own? So I think there's a lot of examples. It doesn't necessarily need to be, a superior subordinate situation. It could be a peer-to-peer conversation. And again, it could be a personal conversation where maybe you need to set some boundaries with a person. So I think there's a lot of different scenarios that can play into that. But I think no matter what situation you're dealing with, having a framework, having some steps to follow, will lead you to a better place. I think what often happens is rather than preparing for something like this, people kind of keep pushing it down, and then they hit the wall or they kind of explode. And then this emotional thing happens where it's not a very effective conversation. So, my thought is have a proactive approach to how do we navigate forward? How do we work through this?
Well, right. I mean, if it's structured and it's thought through, right, there's less emotion and you're able, like you said, prepare. So therefore it's not off the cuff and, you know, it's thoughtful. So I guess,
Right.
is there frameworks in the HR world that you suggest, or,
Yeah.
what could you share?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely a framework, but first of all, I think the first thing a leader or whoever's taking the lead on this conversation needs to think about is how is the other person going to react? And there's always this anticipation, right, of what might they say, etc. So I think it's always helpful to think about that and try to anticipate their reaction. When I have conversations with leaders who I'm trying to encourage maybe to tackle a topic like this, they might say, well, I'm afraid that they might quit if I approach this. I'm worried about damaging our relationship. I'm worried about them saying, why have you never brought this up before, right? There's lots of whys people want to put this conversation off. But the truth is, it really ends up becoming this ticking time bomb that kind of explodes eventually. So, from my perspective, let's start by maybe breaking it down a little bit and talking about some of the steps people could take. Like I said, I think number one is really, how do we take on the elephant in the room? And that's by breaking it down into these bite-sized steps. So I like to call step number one, spot the elephant, right? What is that elephant in the room? And have a conversation around it with maybe someone else to think it through and to kind of be able to frame what is the issue that you really want to confront. Some questions you might want to ask yourself there is, what's happening? Why is this important? What needs to change if it involves a behavior that needs to change? And then most importantly, I think we all learn through examples, right? If you want to talk to me, Joe, about something related to me, connect with me on bringing some examples of things that will resonate with me, experiences that I've had. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess is this a framework that you would share with the manager ahead of time in HR to be able to then get like the pre-work done? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a step-by-step process, whether it's coming from an HR person to a manager or wherever, there's steps you want to go through to prepare and to kind of break it down into smaller steps, right? So I think
Right.
step number one is really, what are you trying to address? And I kind of call that one, what's the elephant, right?
Well, absolutely.
Give
So
it a
then you
name.
basically put all the different ideas and thoughts into, and people have done this in many different design reviews or design aspects, and you put all the little sticky notes up everywhere, and this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm feeling, this is what's potentially needs to change, so you can just throw it up on the wall in your own world and kind of
Yeah.
just start there, right?
I think the sticky note idea is a great one. Like, as an example, let's take an employee who might be a bit passive aggressive, or kind of the way they react to things seems to be creating friction and disharmony in the team, where they maybe have sarcasm, share their opinions in maybe a non-professional manner. I think your idea of citing multiple examples where those things happened, maybe within a recent time frame, call it, the last 2 weeks, last 3 weeks, that could be shared to point that behavior out to the individual is a great place to start. So doing some of your preparation, right?
100%, because that person's going to want to know, well, what do you mean, and when did that happen, and so then they can take hopefully a step back and reflect on, can you see it from someone else's perspective and what's going on. So that's definitely, I think the specifics are needed to share with someone.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I'd be cautioning people to not go so far into the details, because I think taking that first bite means starting simple and basic and being very to the point. The conversation in this example would be, Joe, we need to have this conversation because I'm concerned that your sarcasm and your passive aggressive behavior is creating friction within our team. So that might be my opening line to this conversation. So clearly what we're going to be talking about, rather than me saying, Joe, do you remember 3 weeks ago when this happened? And then the person sitting there going like, yeah. And then they're like wondering, where's this going? Where's this going? Right. So that would be an example of saying, I want to meet with you. This is the topic I want to have a conversation around today. And I want to try to, understand your side of it. And I want to share with you what I'm seeing, why it's important, and why I want to talk about this with you. Right. So understanding, it's not about placing blame or criticizing you. It's around, what is this behavior causing in our team? And this is the reason why I want to talk to you about it, and why I think we need to address it. If that makes sense.
Right. You need to create the awareness of it. And then, like you said, and I like the other part of, what was your opinion, or how did you feel, and get your side of the story, right? Allowing it not to just be one-sided, right? It's a discussion and come to I'm assuming we're going to get there, come to a conclusion, right? So
Right. Yep. So I think we've covered step one, call out the elephant, right? Step
yep.
two, take that first bite, and that's delivering the message clear and setting the stage and getting directly to the point and framing the conversation. And then the next step you already kind of led into. You must have the cheat sheet on the HR handbook here, Joe. You claim to be a recruiter and Mr. Talent Acquisition, but I don't know. You could pretty much you could play the HR part pretty well. But the next step is exactly that, and I call it slow the chew. You're eating this elephant, and this is the pause. This is the invitation for the person who initiated the conversation to invite the other person into the conversation and make sure there's two-way dialogue. Understand their perspective, asking open-ended questions like, hey, what do you think about this? What's your perspective? Have you noticed this? How do you feel about this? Right? And just see what transpires during that conversation.
And if really anyone noticed in a podcast before, have the pause, and it's okay to have some silence to allow folks to talk and, give each other a turn in those aspects and actively listen. So it's a dialogue that way.
Yeah. And truthfully, I would just say some people are so caught off guard where they're like somewhat speechless. I think it's okay at some point after the pause to say, if you need time to think about this before we have a two-way dialogue, that's fine, right? Because I want to talk this through. And if you're not ready today, then maybe we should agree to park this here and let's reconnect tomorrow. Because at that point, if you're not engaging the other person in the conversation, you're really never going to be successful. It's never going to be a successful conversation, right? So now you've opened this door, but there you might, very likely, if someone's caught off guard and they weren't aware of this, they could be taken back and not ready to have a constructive dialogue about this. So
in that situation though, Jill, what's the fear of them stirring and brewing? Like they're caught off guard. They're, it's maybe a not so great conversation that's brewing in this, but now they're taking it back to their desk and they're going to think about it and distracted. And how do you overcome that situation?
Well, I mean, part of me feels like I don't know that it can be overcome. I think you have to use your best judgment if there's any risk involved with that person being maybe fit to go back to the team, right? Or how they're going to react. It could be a serious enough issue where you kind of say, hey, maybe they need the rest of the day off, but I think every person needs to use their own judgment there to say, in this situation where we're parking the topic, what could happen next and how do I plan and prepare for that? But I think we're always wanting.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, if we back up, this conversation is typically the manager and or it could be anybody, right, with the two different folks. But should there be a third person in that conversation, like an HR person or someone else, or no?
I would say not in this example, because I think this is just a natural coaching tool, right? About how do we give each other feedback? How do we navigate together, working together as a team. So I don't see this being like invite a third party, because what I would say there is at that point, you're not looking to seek to understand. You already know there's going to be some potential repercussions or reprisal for the behavior. So this is more of an early tool to when things are kind of going in a direction that isn't either clear or comfortable, you as a leader or as an individual kind of invite getting things back on track, right?
Got it. You're cutting it off at the pass, trying to avoid a bigger situation, but it's a behavior or a situation that you noticed and that needs to be corrected. So got it.
Right. Yeah. And I would say, honestly, I had a conversation recently with a person I know who was talking to me about navigating a relationship with a colleague at work where they feel like things have gradually moved in a direction that they're not comfortable with. The person is maybe expecting more from them than, their job really is supposed to, cover. and they've now recognized, hey, I've kind of fallen into this trap and now I'm not sure how to backpedal, right? So there's an example of a non-managerial situation of saying, hey, I like this person, I've been supporting them, but now I'm really uncomfortable because my boss expects me to be doing all these other things, and it's starting to affect me and my performance, and it's making me uncomfortable. Her question is, how do I have this conversation? How do I try to steer things back on track, right? So there's an example of maybe a real life situation everybody can relate to, and saying, it's not always a subordinate and manager situation, but it could be with just reframing boundaries and expectations with a colleague and trying to clarify. So.
Got it. So now we've chewed up the conversation and topic into it. What comes next? Like how does it's not the end yet, right? Because we haven't solved anything. So what's the next stage?
Yeah, I think the next stage, once we have that two-way dialogue in that conversation, is trying to find solutions together, right? To focus on a constructive dialogue around defining what needs to change, what are each of our expectations, questions around maybe what support's needed. I think always having a conversation of what does success look like, what would the desired state look like, and trying to paint that picture is helpful. And this is really an important step because then you're trying to leave with clear alignment. We're on the same page here. We're leaving this conversation knowing what's next, knowing what each of us expects and needs. And, it gives you that platform to say, how are we going to follow up on this? So, in a situation, the employee might say, like, hey, how will I know how I'm doing, right? And I think the manager should maybe propose in that case, hey, let's put a weekly conversation on the calendar and we'll just touch base and we'll check in with each other and I'll give you feedback,
Right, because
etc.
it's not always metrics driven, right? It's not a potential output piece. It could be behaviors and other things that are intangible that you can't see. So I think that side of it, and I think where you're coming with it is a solution together, right? So you're both solving it, not the manager directing it, that this is what needs to happen. How are you going to do that? Getting them involved so it's a equal plan and it makes sense to the person that needs the help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the example I provided for this passive aggressive and sarcasm, things could rise up to the surface that the person has been keeping to themselves. It could be a response to them feeling maybe left out of things or, taken advantage of, so there could be a lot of things that come out of the conversation that provide some understanding and clarity that give that leader a roadmap to, oh, there's issues here I was unaware of that I have some ownership to try to understand more and try to resolve, right? It's almost always a two-way street. So just to be clear that, what comes out of that conversation, there's some ownership there, right? For the person initiating that conversation to say, yeah, we both own this. And there could be other things. It's not the reason we sat down, but then I learned things through this conversation. And in order for me to try to turn this around, I need to, address some of those other problems. So
It's like the iceberg, right? Sometimes the tip, small piece is only showing, and there's a deep, different factors that are playing underneath the water that you can't see. And I guess the ultimate hope is you actually come out with a stronger relationship, because if you can build this, cut it off at the pass, you're building that rapport and you're trying to help them. I mean, that's the whole point. It's not about reprimand. It's about support. It's about growth. It's about community together. And, if you're, again, not every single time, but hopefully they gain an extra respect that you're bringing that to somebody's attention to support them.
yeah, and what I would just say is there's probably leaders out there saying, I know I've put these conversations off and like it's too late. And I would just tell you, it's never too late, right? Everybody gets a clean slate. And I think some leaders would be surprised that employees want more of their time and attention. They want them to know that they're aware of what they're doing and what they're spending time on, right? So I don't think it always has to be something that's negative necessarily. It could be more about, I noticed you're working late hours. And can you explain that to me? Are there some bottlenecks, right? Like, help me understand what some of the issues that are happening are today that are impacting you.
But yeah, it's not
Um,
all negative, right? Like you said, whether long hours or you're not taking lunch or I haven't seen these things, and you're there as a leader to support in many different ways, right? Yes, it's work related, but other factors play into it, and you got to be aware and the awareness. And it's even harder, I guess, how any thoughts around that virtual and hybrid world of how you manage some of those things, Jill, in your perspective?
I think FaceTime's always possible, even if it's not us being together in the same room. I would just say I lead a team across the North America region, having that FaceTime, meaning dedicated time where we're talking to one another, we have our cameras on, we're looking at each other in the eyes, really can develop the same level of
Mhm.
connection and rapport. I think the only drawback of that is you can't necessarily appreciate what's coming at that individual and what their environment's like on a daily basis when you have that remote proximity. I think whenever it's possible, I found spending a few days in the different locations where my team works give me that landscape, give me that lens to say, you know what, I know what's coming at them every day, and I appreciate, what they're dealing with on a daily basis. And, you kind of have that dose of reality. So I would just say, while it's not optimal, there's ways to overcome that. And I'm sure there are people that say, hey, the distance is too far and that proximity isn't there. In which case, I would say you can invite questions around those things to say, hey, what was your day like?
Yep.
And you really have to kind of try to probe to have that picture and paint that picture and show that care, show that concern. And I always say you have to give to get. So sometimes I find that if I talk about myself or my day or what I'm experiencing or what some of my struggles are, then I find that the people I'm talking to want to open up as well. Right.
Yep.
So that's just a strategy that I've used to say, if I give a little bit, I'm likely to get something back in return. Some people are more guarded than others with those things, but I think over time, if you put the time on the calendar and you follow the same protocols, you will build that rapport in that relationship.
It's all about communication, as I don't want to sum up all of that, but it's communication, right? It's FaceTime, it's messages, it's
Yeah,
texts.
building trust with each other,
Yep.
right? We're committed, we're investing in each other, we're building that trust, and, you know, trust will take you pretty far. So, and the more trust you can build, the more you can help the person on the other side of these conversations understand your intentions are, you have the best intentions for the outcome of a conversation. It's not to place blame, it's just to try to, move forward and to try to make sure there's more clarity. Um,
So we've spotted the elephant. We started chewing up the conversation and the discussion. We're making steps together. How do we finish, and what's the dessert in this model to be able to support them?
Yeah, I think, number one, you want to close your conversation with clarity and accountability. And this is sometimes where leaders fail. They say, oh boy, I took on the elephant. I had the difficult conversation, and then it's crickets. There's no follow up, there's no conversation. This is where I feel like this is the most unfortunate time to drop the ball, because it's very important that, especially in a leader to a subordinate situation, when they see the person behaving in a new light and they notice they're no longer, maybe being, sarcastic and other things, and they see them being very positive and supportive, it's really important to call that out and say, hey, I noticed this, you know, and it's just this whole theory of, you know, feedback and positive reinforcement. So I think to the extent where you catch people doing the right things, don't be the leader that only has conversations with their people about doing the wrong things, please. No one wants to work for you. But just to say, hey, good job. Thank you. I appreciate your proactivity on this. I appreciate your engagement and your support, etc. I think, I can't say that enough times, that the more you positively reinforce and provide those types of feedback to your team, you're going to see more good come your way than bad.
Well, yeah, and that's for, employee and subordinates, but also as if you're working with a leader, right? Hey, I really
Mhm.
appreciate your support in that call or in that meeting or different other things. Yeah, you want to close that loop and showcase that you followed through, you saw, you recognized the change or the progression to change as well, and that's a great follow up too. And because people need that confidence, right? That, hey, I did, I heard you, I listened, and I'm doing this, and not, gone on deaf ears in that aspect of it, right? Because,
Right.
in those perspectives. So, yeah, please don't be that person.
Yeah. And I think you've already alluded to this, Joe, but as we navigate these types of conversations with people, we build trust, we become closer. So it's awkward at first, it's a little uncomfortable. I think everyone generally feels better when things are out in the open and they've been able to, state their mind, and then people can move on, right? Because I think there's a lot of cases where I, as an HR leader, have talked to a manager and tried to encourage them to take on one of these elephants and tackle it, where they've had this dread, and then ultimately they'll come back and say, you know what, this person's been worried about something for a long time. And now that I've had this conversation, they kind of feel more at ease about it. So I would just say a lot of times your employees are in touch with certain things. Um, and, I think you might be surprised that both parties feel better when, the air is clear and the elephant is no longer, uh, a 1,000-ton beast.
Yeah, absolutely. And me personally, I've had both sides, right? Where, I've had to have the hard conversation that was about a performance or a situation, and we turned it around. Right. And it's tackling it, being honest, open, give them the details behind what's happening. And then, hey, let's work towards this. And, it's extra work for both, right? Because they've got to recognize what's going on and you've got to recognize and follow up. But it's worth it, especially when you see them turn it around and then outperforming the rest of the team. It was awesome, right? And that's where you give kudos back to that side of it. And then, there's also, when it's, hey, you know what? I pull somebody aside after a meeting, and I'm like, unfortunately, that was a inappropriate comment. We got to work on that. I've also heard, it was I caught it in that moment, and I, had that discussion right afterwards. But it wasn't the first time, but it was like, you know what? I'm going to nip this in the bud now and just drive it. So I didn't follow all of your steps because I did it at the spur of the moment, but I needed to because it needed to be resolved, right? And the person was like, oh my God, I didn't realize I offended somebody, right? And that's where you have to understand their situation and go, well, unfortunately you did, right? And now we need to address that, and let's knock that off before it becomes any worse and we have to, take this to another level, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think in your example, that person would want to know they offended someone.
Yep.
And then things will make sense to them. So an apology goes a long way, right? How they carry themselves around that person in the future, right? It will all dictate how their relationship, ends up developing. So I think it's a great example. But I don't know, Joe. I had this topic because I just recently have had some conversations that other people around me have been avoiding having. And I thought, today might be a good day to tackle this and take on the elephant.
Well, I'm going to say I'm not going to have elephant for dinner, but it was a great topic, and I think everyone needs to, again, tackle it and head on, right? You don't want to, and that's the cliche of actually heading on an elephant. You probably will lose, but you actually gain in this situation where it becomes a better work environment, a better team environment, and people can grow and be better because we had the discussion and not just let it simmer there behind the scenes. So I love it. I thought it was a great conversation, Joe.
Well, I would just say I think everyone walks away from these conversations feeling some sense of relief and some weight has been lifted off of them. Not to play down this elephant ton analogy too many times, but thanks for humoring me, Joe, and having this conversation. I hope it's helpful to the our listeners out there, and I hope that some people will give it a try and see if it makes what could be an uncomfortable situation a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more manageable for them.
I think everyone has learned something, and if you have, we would love to hear from you and put it in the comments in our podcast here. We appreciate you tuning in and listening, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. And Jill, thanks for joining again and being a part of it, and everyone else, thank you again.
Bye, everyone.